As you know by now, I'm sure, my name is James Mello. I am currently a pastor in LaGrange in Carrollton, Georgia, Western Georgia. Usually I would say kind of southern, but compared to you, it's actually northern. And so that's what I'm doing currently, but a lot of my background, a lot of my experience has been working in social work in various capacities. I've worked with a lot of people in crisis situations, especially teens. I've worked with teens in the foster care system, juvenile justice system, runaway and homeless youth, and all of these different capacities. And I think I shared this morning a little bit, but those of you who weren't here this morning, I also kind of went through my own trauma, my own challenges. And so all of those experiences brought me to a point where I really wanted to understand our brains better. I wanted to understand a little bit more about what we can do when people have been through a lot of trauma, or if they're dealing with heavy anxiety or depression or these other types of challenges that people go through. So I was blessed to be able to go up to Andrews, and I worked on seminary, which is what pastors do, but I also got to take a second course, the MSW, Masters of Social Work. And so tonight, in these ongoing conversations, this is not intended to be a sermon. This isn't intended to be a time where I speak at you the whole time. I've been doing these trainings all over the place. Just this year, I've been to Kentucky and New Jersey, and actually got to do some training even in Thailand, which was super awesome. That was a blessing. So I've been blessed to be able to share this information, but what I found is the most beneficial part of it is the conversations that can come. So I want to encourage you, and it's going to be a little bit more challenging. I have to stay up here. They told me I have to stay up here because I won't look as pretty down there for all the people streaming. So I'm stuck on the stage, but if you raise your hand and wave it around like you just don't care, we'll be sure to get you a microphone, because I want to be sure that you have an opportunity to give feedback, to ask some questions, and just to make sure that we really cater this time toward what's really going on in your worlds. Is that okay? Okay, so that's a little bit of my background. Let's see if I can get this up. I wanted to show you, this is a group called the International Center for Trauma Education and Care. It's based out of Andrews University. I'm an associate with them, and I did a lot of training through their program. And what they do is they go all over the world, and they train churches and schools and families and everybody else that wants to hear about the impact of trauma on the brain, and also how to build resiliency, what we can do about it. So that's really going to be the basis and the foundation of a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. So I just want to give you some idea of these next few days. So tonight I really want to give you an understanding, a basic understanding when we say trauma. So if you work with young people at all, or if you are a young person, you know we're always talking now about, that was traumatizing, right? That was trauma. And so we want to actually define what trauma is, because not everything is trauma. Same thing with depression. Not everything, having a bad day and being sad is not clinical depression. So we want to clarify some of those things. But what real trauma is and what it does to our brain can help us to understand so much of why people behave the way that they behave. And so that's what we're going to get into tonight, sort of asking that question that you might ask sometimes, what's wrong with you? Or what's wrong with me? Right? Why am I behaving or acting the way that I am? Why is that person acting the way they are? Tomorrow night, we're going to continue that talk on trauma a little bit, but I also have a special guest. She's a student at AAA, and she wanted to come and share. She's been sharing with me at various places about her own journey through mental health. And she came to a crisis point herself, and got very desperate in her own mental health. And through that experience, she was able to get some help, and it's a powerful story. And I hope it will give some hope to people who are struggling, or if you know somebody who's going through something who's really struggling. So that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow night. Monday will be about what can we do, okay? So the first 2 nights we're talking about all this trauma and all this sadness, all these hard things that we're going through, but we really want practical tools. We want to be able to help people. So starting on Monday, I really want to introduce all these different things that are very simple, that you don't have to have an advanced degree to know about, but genuinely do save and transform lives. What I've found over and over again is that we overthink so much in mental health. And at the end of the day, it's the basic things that really make a difference. Everybody needs a friend. Everybody needs to drink some water. Everybody needs a nap from time to time. Those things, you'd be surprised how much they can transform mental health. So we're going to talk about all that as well. Tuesday night, I really wanted to dig into a little bit more about the idea of deep depression and also the concept of suicide and how to help somebody who is struggling with whether or not they want to end their life. So we want to talk real seriously about that and what we can do, what we shouldn't do, because there are some things that we try to do that we're trying to help, and it's not actually as helpful as we think. And then Wednesday, I wanted to talk a little bit more about building communities that are intentional, that are places where people can feel safe enough and vulnerable enough to really heal, to take the mask off and do the things that they need to do in order to get better. So that's where I'm coming from. I want to tell you, I'm not the expert. There's probably people here in this audience who have more experience than I do. You know, I've been blessed with this training, and I do have I just was counting it up, I think about 10 years now working in social work in various areas. But that doesn't mean that I am the expert and I'm the only one who knows anything. This isn't what this is about. My goal as a pastor and as a licensed social worker is to be a person that starts conversations, because the reality is we don't talk about these things in intentional ways enough, and we need to. So especially this year, my goal is just to do whatever it takes to have heavy and difficult conversations with people in meaningful ways, because I know that that can save lives. And that's really what I'm trying to do. So, like I shared last time, or this morning, you may not be going through anything. I don't know what I'm saying right there. There's a good chance that half the people sitting in this audience have not been through extremely traumatic events in their past. That's wonderful, and you should praise the Lord if that's you, right? Perhaps you've come from an extremely healthy family and you lived in a great community with a loving church. If that's you, praise the Lord. I'm telling you, you know people in your lives, probably people even you're related to, where that's not their story, right? So if you are the person who is healthy and doing well, I want to encourage you to listen and take notes and pay attention and have conversation, because I guarantee you're going to come across people who are not doing well. And we want to be equipped to help those people, right? That's the goal. That's the dream. Now, there are other people who are probably sitting here who are going through a lot, or maybe have some heavy stuff in their past. And I did want to remind everybody that what we're going to talk about here over these next few nights, we're going to talk about heavy things. This isn't your normal conversation. And so, number one, I just want to forewarn you that we'll talk about some challenging subjects, and I want you to be aware of that. And also, it is perfectly fine if this is stirring something up in you, if it gets to a point where it's just a little overwhelming for the moment, it's perfectly fine to step out and gather yourself, take some space, breathe, and then when you're ready, come back in. So I just want to tell you that now, because you may be surprised sometimes when we discuss some of these things, what can come up, including some things that you might have forgotten about, or things that you thought that you had already worked through, and now all of a sudden something is happening. So I want to remind you of that right now. As we get started, just to break the ice a little bit, I would love for you to turn to someone nearby you, and I know some people are groaning like, oh, do I really have to do this? You don't absolutely have to do it, but I would love for you to do this. Tell somebody your name. I know people are sitting next to people they know usually, so you can just reintroduce yourself. And I would love for you to just discuss amongst each other for a couple minutes here. What is one question that you would love to have addressed during this series? What's something mental health related, something having to do with this series that you'd like to talk about, or you hope that we cover? So take 3 minutes and do that with the people next to you. Sounds like most of the conversations have died down. Is there anyone who is brave enough to be the one to raise their hand and share with me, share with all of us what it is that you would hope to have addressed during this time? I see a hand over there and over here. Awesome. Look at the young ones leading the way. I love it. What's your name? Lloyd? We got to get that mic on. It didn't sound like we could hear it. Lloyd, what's your question?
I'm going to be a doctor.
Are you going to be a doctor? Is that what you said?
Yes?
Awesome. Congratulations. We need doctors. All right. Do you have a business card? I'll call you when you're ready. All right.
I want to know, what do you do if someone or something is giving you depression and anxiety?
What do you do if someone or something is giving you depression or anxiety? That's a great question. That's something that we're definitely going to talk about during this time. So I hope you're able to be here each night. Anybody else want to share something?
I want to know, how do you recognize what causes either someone else or yourself to have breakdowns when you don't know what it is until it's already happened?
Okay. So what is the cause, or where are these breakdowns coming from when people are having them? Yeah, that's a good one. Chris?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I've been counseling with this pastor for 6 months now, and life has gotten so much better. And I just want to learn how to do this for other people on the street that I may not even know.
Praise the Lord.
You know, I'm starting to find out everybody needs friends.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, so your question is, how do I help other people in the most efficient way or effective way possible?
How to deal with stress.
How to deal with stress. Absolutely, yeah. And that's where we're going to get to in a couple nights. I see hands all over. That's awesome.
Now, of course, everybody has questions. No, I just really want to learn more about helping with grief for kids specifically. My daughter's, we lost grandpa and uncle and all these different things, and she's 6. So trying, it's hard for adults to wrap our minds around it. So trying to help on kid levels because they have so many stressors nowadays.
Appreciate that. I'm going to take a note of that one because that's something I want to be sure that I keep in mind as we prepare for the other nights too. Yes, someone else.
As it relates to depression, I think I have an understanding of like how to get through it, but my question is, how do you prevent it from returning?
How do you prevent depression from returning? That's great. So just a little preview, and we have another hand here. With some of the stuff we're talking about tonight and tomorrow night, we're going to talk about stress and when stress becomes overwhelming. Oftentimes when stress becomes overwhelming, that's when we're getting to the points where our anxiety, our breakdowns, our depression shows up. And so a lot of it is, can we manage stress in healthy ways in order to prevent it from getting to those points?
Okay. So my question is that, like once you've built relationships with people and they start opening up to you, when they, share things that they're struggling with and just how deeply that goes, sometimes I'm like, I don't know what to do with this. Like, thank you for sharing, but I want to help you. I'm a fixer, and I want tools to be able to help people who actually end up opening up to me.
I love it. That's awesome. Yes, we're definitely going to be talking about that through this week. And one thing to remember, especially when we're fixers, is like remembering sort of our role. And our role as a friend versus our role as like a mental health professional is going to be different. And so sometimes we want to be the counselor that we're not really. Our role is friend, and that's a very, extremely important role.
Hi. My question is related to the trauma. Is trauma a chemical imbalance, and can it be a subconscious act? Like you don't even know that it's there, but it happens. And then if you can kind of dive into that and how that shows up in anxiety.
Sure. Okay, that's good. I see another hand back here. Yeah, we're going to talk about trauma. When we talk about the brain, technically, the brain has always got chemistry going on, right? So there's always some chemical thing happening. We're going to address some of the other elements as well, but that's a great question.
My question is, how important is self-care in dealing with trauma?
That's an excellent question. Excellent question. We're definitely going to address self-care and what that looks like, and also some of the myths that can come from the word self-care, for sure. Anybody else? I appreciate this. These are all excellent questions. I'm going to keep going then, and if you do have other questions throughout this time, just feel free to get his attention. And again, you can interrupt me most of the time, unless I'm right in the middle of something I'm super excited about. But I do want to have conversation. So if there's something that you're wondering about based on what I'm saying, feel free to jump in. But one of the first things that I wanted to bring out is I want you to just imagine that person who is the most challenging for you to deal with, right? Some of you are like, that's my kids. Yeah, it might be, okay? But I'm thinking, you know, for some of you, especially if you work with kids in a school setting or something else, there's always one or two children that are like a little bit more challenging, a little bit more frustrating. Those of you who work in a church setting, there's always a church member or two that might be a little bit more difficult to work with, shall we say. And we could see this anywhere, right? There's always sort of these people in our lives, and if you can't think of anybody, that might be you. I'm just saying. No, when we get to those people, though, the question that we ask a lot of times is, what is wrong with that person? And you want to rip your hair out, and you start asking these questions. Is that person just a terrible person? Is it genetics? Is it trauma? Is it the ozone layer? Like, really, what is going on with these people? Why do they behave the way that they behave? Now, I'm not going to address all the reasons why people behave the way they behave, but we are going to focus especially on the impact of trauma on people. And when we ask the question, what is wrong with people, we might be asking the wrong question. And so I really want you to hold on to that. When we ask people, what is wrong with you, we might be asking the wrong question. Same with us. When we make terrible decisions, we self-destruct, or we self-sabotage relationships, and we sit there and say, what is wrong with me? There might be a better question at play. So hold that in your mind. Let's define trauma just in general. Because again, we use this word a lot now. This has become a very popular buzzword recently. But what is trauma? So trauma, the idea of trauma came from the battlefield, right? So we know there's trauma, physical trauma, like a wound. That's the Greek root word. But then also we know that there was a time when soldiers were coming back from the battlefield, and physically they were fine, but they were not able to function in the world anymore, right? They didn't know what was going on, and they called it shell shock in World War I. They had all these different terminologies for it because they couldn't quite identify. How could someone be physically unharmed and yet still not be able to manage their daily lives the way they were before? Something had changed with this person. Well, what we've realized and come to understand all throughout, the advances in technology and in science is that there is a wound that takes place. It's an invisible wound, but there is a wound that takes place within our brain. And that's what we are talking about when we talk about trauma. Not physical trauma, we're talking about mental trauma. So Dr. Van de Kolk is a very well-known authority on this topic, and he identifies trauma as something that is an event or a series of events that overwhelms our central nervous system, and it alters the way we process and recall memories. So this is an event. We all have stressful events, and we're going to talk about stress tonight a fair amount. We all have stressful events in our lives, and actually stress can be a good thing. But when it overwhelms our capacity to cope, it becomes toxic stress, and it actually causes damage to us, causes damage to the way we process things. So when an event has become traumatic, it's actually stored in a completely different place in our memory. So this is really fascinating to me. So normally when you have, if I told you, think back to your favorite childhood memory, So you're thinking back. You're actually processing back in your time, in your life. You're going to this place and you say, well, you know, we used to go to the beach when I was a kid at this time, or at Christmas time we always had cookies and then there were stockings. Whatever it is, you're thinking back and it's within the context of your life. You can recognize that event's not happening now. It happened then and it still has pleasant, you know, feelings for us now. What happens with a traumatic memory is it actually fractures the way that we store that memory. So instead of it being within the context of our life where we can say that event happened, it was not a pleasant event, but it did take place. Instead, it's an event that is still happening every time we get triggered by it. Are you with me? So this means that when you have a traumatic event, say it's a car accident. So for me, I had a very mildly traumatic event. I was up in Michigan. Michigan has plenty of ice, but I'm experienced in driving in snow and ice, so I wasn't that concerned. But one day I was driving, and I hit this patch where there was no snow on the road, there was no ice visible on the road, but it had just been raining, and that rain had frozen to the road, and it was not visible. We call that black ice. And so here I am going down on the interstate, minding my business, driving the normal speed, and then my car just loses all control. And I flew off the side, and I was on the phone, and I'm freaking out, and managed to miss everything, and I had to get pulled out because the car was way down on the side of the road. There was snow on the side. But that event was traumatic to me in that moment, right? What I found was the next week, I was driving in the same conditions, which was, you know, fairly clear conditions, not a lot of snow, not a lot of issues, but it was overcast, right? You know, slightly drizzling, and I had the exact same reaction as if I had just had the accident. So I started shaking a little bit. I started getting really sort of panicky in that moment. All of a sudden, I'm driving on the interstate going like 40 and wanting to go slower not because there was danger there, right? There was not black ice at that time, but because in my mind, the traumatic memory was still relevant to me in that moment. These conditions remind me of that time, and therefore, I'm having a hard time functioning. Does that make sense? So that's what happens with a traumatic memory. This is why when you tell people, why can't you just get over it, right? That's not how it works. People cannot just get over something when it's a traumatic event. I have a friend who came to me and she was overwhelmed because she'd watched a scene in a movie. And watching that scene in a movie as a 50-plus-something-year-old woman lived her full adult life, it reminded her of something that had happened in her teens. And all of a sudden, she couldn't function. For 2 weeks, she was in this fight, flight, freeze stage that we're going to talk about. Because that memory was still a traumatic memory. And part of what mental health work is supposed to do is help people take those memories and put them within the context of their life so they can move forward. But that's what trauma is. It's something that is overwhelming your system. Trauma is events that confront people with such horror and threat that it may temporarily or permanently alter their capacity to cope. So for me, that accident was temporary. I don't get that experience anymore. I was able to work past that because it wasn't that damaging to me and it wasn't that damaging to my system. However, it could get to the point where I don't want to drive ever anymore, right? Because I'm just so overwhelmed every time I'm behind the wheel. That's when it becomes traumatic to the point that I would need somebody else's help to get me past that situation. So it alters permanently or temporarily their capacity to cope, their perception of the threat, and their self-concept, the way that they view the world, the way they view threats. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about trauma. It's damage or injury to the mind, and it creates challenges in functioning. So we are all going to have negative things happen to us. You cannot get through this life without bad things happening. But how our capacity to cope is directly connected to what has happened to us in the past and how we learned how to be resilient and how we learned how to handle things back then. And that's why the same event could happen to 5 different people and you'll have 5 different reactions to that event. There's oftentimes a lot of assumption that if you go through a traumatic event, you have to go to counseling. Well, you should talk to a professional at least once, right, afterwards and see how you're coping. But not everybody, not all 5 of them are going to have to. When we talk about post-traumatic stress, PTSD, you've heard that, right? Sometimes people think that everybody who goes through a traumatic event will get PTSD. That's not true at all. About 60% of people will not develop any post-traumatic stress at all after going through a traumatic event. About 20% will deal with post-traumatic stress. And then about 20% will actually deal with what we call post-traumatic growth. People who find themselves more resilient, in a better place, with a deeper sense of purpose than they had before the event. So what that means is, just because you go through a traumatic event does not mean your life is going to be miserable and everything's overwhelming, right? What it means is you went through an event, and now we need to see if you have the tools in the community to be able to manage what happened, to be able to manage that stress. Some people will, some people will not. If it is taking over your life, that doesn't mean that you're a weaker person, right? It doesn't mean you're a lesser person. It just means that your system is overwhelmed. And we need to find ways to manage the system so that you're not in a place of being overwhelmed anymore. Okay, another way of looking at this is big T and little t traumas. So when we think of trauma, we tend to think of the big T traumas. War, right? That's where we got the idea of trauma. Any major disaster, sexual abuse, a serious accident, witnessing a death, domestic violence, crime, those are big T traumas. Yes, they really, everyone would agree that those are traumatic events. We tend to be very worried about people. But what we don't recognize oftentimes is that little t traumas are equally damaging. That in the brain, if you do brain scans, you can't tell the difference between who was physically abused and who received emotional neglect. You can't tell the difference in a brain. All trauma impacts the brain in the same type of way. So these little t traumas are just as important to pay attention to. Someone who's emotionally abused. So some people grow up and say, I don't know what's wrong with me. Like, my parents never laid a hand on me, right? But I'm just struggling through my life and I can't understand why. And sometimes when I ask people, tell me a little bit about your parents, how they treated you. What was happening was they were being belittled, right, their whole life, told they were dumb or stupid or not capable or all these other things. And that was just as traumatic to their brain as someone who was actually physically hit. But most people don't recognize that. Experiencing neglect. So neglect is a really super sad thing. What we found is, some of these people who have been capable of some of the worst crimes, if you look at what's happened in the world and some of these pretty terrible mass events that have taken place, there's the ones that we can come to understand their history, there's almost always trauma in their history. That's no doubt. What's happened oftentimes is they've taken that trauma and then they've also kind of come up with a victim mentality where it was never my fault, it's everyone else's fault, and therefore they deserve to be hurt, right? But what we found is the people who are capable of some of the worst stuff are people who it wasn't the physical abuse, it was the neglect. Because the fact of the matter is that we learn about human connection based on our caregivers. So when a baby cries, what does a caregiver do? They pick them up, they take care of them. If the diaper's full, they take care of the diaper. If they need to burp, they burp the baby. Whatever it is, the stimulus is the cry, and then there's a response. If there's a consistent response, then the baby learns that my caregiver is secure with me. I'm secure with my caregiver, and I'm going to be okay. And so they learn through mirror neurons, which is a whole different thing, but what they learn is how they are treated as babies is how they understand human connection works. Sometimes in foster care, you get babies who don't cry at all. And you say, oh, these are the easiest babies in the world, right? They never cry, they're so simple, they're so easy to take care of, and it seems like a positive thing, but it's actually a really major danger sign. Because what happened with a lot of those babies is they learned when they cried, nobody came to pick them up. So they learned that crying did not provide for their needs. And then they learn at an extremely young age, I cannot rely on other people to provide for my needs. And so they lose the connection with other people. And that's a very difficult thing to overcome. It's not impossible, and that's what we're going to talk about. All of these things are not impossible to overcome, but they are challenges that people have to go through. Losses, bullying, failure experiences, abrupt moves, repeated criticism, all of those things can be traumatic as well. They can overwhelm our capacity to cope. Now, What decides how overwhelming it is a number of things. But the two major things are how young you were when the trauma took place and how often it took place. And of course, the severity of what it was. So that's why oftentimes as an adult, we can handle some pretty heavy stuff and come out on the other side and be okay if we had a pretty healthy childhood. But if we had a difficult childhood, even a small trauma as an adult can throw us way off. And we're like, why am I overreacting to this thing that's going on? Well, it's because we didn't experience a lot of resilience growing up. So it's a lot harder for us to handle those tools now. Is this making sense so far? Am I with you? Are you with me? I don't know if I'm with you. Okay, one last thing on trauma. I think this is just the different types, and it's kind of cut off there. This is pretty small. I don't know if you'll be able to read it. But there's different types of trauma. So there's acute trauma. That's a single event. There was one really bad thing that happened. That's an acute traumatic event. Okay, so you were part of a massive accident. That's an acute event. Chronic is repeated and prolonged. So this is somebody who over the course of years was abused by somebody. They were taken advantage of. And so it just continued to happen, repeated and prolonged. Complex is when it's more than one type of trauma. There's different things that happen. So if you've ever heard of CPTSD, CPTSD is things where we can't just say there's one single source of trauma. This poor person has been through so many different things. So it's overwhelmed them, which means you have to work through a lot in order to help somebody be well. And then vicarious trauma. This is when you have an accumulation of exposure to the pain of others. You work in a field where you're dealing with trauma all the time, and it starts to get to you. And it starts to overwhelm you. And maybe your family and your life is okay, but all of a sudden you just want to cry, and you don't know why, or you feel frozen, you don't know how to help others. Secondary trauma is very similar to that. It's a natural but disruptive byproduct of working with traumatized individuals. It can happen quickly, even in only one meeting. So when someone is describing some really heavy stuff to you, and this doesn't just have to be with professionals. Say someone mentioned a friend. Your friend comes and talks to you about all the stuff that they've been going through, and they start sharing some really heavy stuff. You've got to also pay attention afterwards to your response, because your response, you can become overwhelmed very quickly too. When someone describes an event where someone dies and they describe it in detail, that can lead you to thinking through that process and that event as well. And you can end up traumatizing yourself. Those of you who are old enough, you know this happened with 9/11, right? At 9/11, what did they do on TV after 9/11? Over and over and over again. We saw those planes hit the building over and over. Right? So every single one of us, if we were old enough, you could say, where were you when you found out about 9/11? We all remember that event. And we remember afterwards seeing it over and over and over again. So what do you think happened to us as a people? We became traumatized. The vast majority of people had to deal with trauma just from the 9/11 event. I'm told that that's very similar to what happened when JFK was killed, was assassinated, or MLK. These massive events. So you don't even have to witness it firsthand in order for the trauma to impact you. Here's the crazy and super sad thing now, you know, with things being live streamed and things being posted online. A lot of young people are being exposed. You know, we talk about these things like these mass shootings, these terrible events, and a lot of them are live streamed. And those are then put up online, and our young people who might be growing up in happy, healthy homes oftentimes have access to these events, and they witness them. And they can have traumatic experiences as a result of that, and nobody can put their finger on why this kid is going through so much or struggling so much, because they don't know what these kids are witnessing. You know, online there's a lot of things that kids get exposed to way too young and way too early. How many of you heard of the average childhood experiences before, the ACE study? I know there's a handful of you. You're an MSW, of course you've heard of it. The ACE study, and I think we'll probably get close to ending on this. This is a really foundational study. When we're talking about trauma, we're talking about the challenges of people's life and what has happened to them. People found out, this was several years ago, a couple decades ago now, they were taking medical histories in the hospitals, and they were starting to recognize that oftentimes people who had a negative mental health history, or if they had some things happen to them in the past, they tended to have negative physical health as well. And so they said, well, I wonder if that would actually bear up scientifically. So they put together this study, and they studied in the initial one 17,000 people, and they asked them a series of questions about what had happened to them as children, and they compared that to their physical health, and what they found was there was a link. There was a correlation between what had happened to you in the past and how healthy you tended to be in the present. So this was massive. I mean, we're not just talking about mental health here. We're talking about physical health, diabetes, cancer, stroke, early death. All of them were tied, they were connected to what had happened to you in the past. And so this is a public health thing. They've done numerous studies since then, and the studies have been consistent ever since. There's some changes in some things, but what they found is through the ACE study that people who have had negative things happen to them in the past are more likely to experience anything from depression and suicidality to an increased risk of alcoholism to an increased risk of having a stroke, dying several years before their peers. That's shocking, right? Now, the great thing is that's not a death sentence, right? What it means is if we're not aware of that, we may not make the connection between what has happened to us and why we do the things we do now. Are you with me? So these are the three realms of the original ACE study. There's abuse, neglect, and then there's household dysfunction. But I decided I was going to do this with you. I don't want any of you to answer this out loud. I don't want any of you to raise your hand or anything like that. But I'm going to ask the questions because it's very simple. It's 10 questions. And I want you to think as simple yes or no questions. And I want you to consider your score, especially if you've never done this before. Okay? Now, these are heavy questions. If you want to, you can hold your fingers in your pocket and just count. Whatever it is, keep track of how many out of 10. Okay? First one. Before your 18th birthday, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? So if that's a yes, that's 1. If it's a no, you're still at 0. Before your 18th birthday, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Before your 18th birthday, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Before your 18th birthday, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Or your family did not look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Before your 18th birthday, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, you had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you? Or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? Before your 18th birthday, was a biological parent ever lost to you through divorce, abandonment, or some other reason? Before your 18th birthday, was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? Or sometimes, often, or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard? Or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or a knife? Before your 18th birthday, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? Before your 18th birthday, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Before your 18th birthday, did a household member go to prison? Okay, you're not telling anybody your scores, but here's what we found out. About 40%, I think, of Americans, if I recall correctly, have a score of about 0. So these are the ones who have been blessed to have grown up in a home that was healthy, that was generally well-adjusted. No home is perfect, but they were in a decent place. And then a few more, I think about 20% have a score of 1. And so that means that they did have some trauma, some adverse childhood experience. But thankfully, it probably not enough to have a massive impact on their lives, at least having to do with a trauma. What they found is anybody with a score above 3 were at an incredibly high risk for all these negative health outcomes. Now, when I learned about this, this blew my mind because I did not think that I came from a traumatic household. But full disclosure for me, my score is above 3, and I realized at that time, wow, there was more trauma in my life than I realized, and it gave me an understanding of why I made a lot of the decisions I made through my adolescence, and even now why I have these tendencies of like self-sabotage and these other things. Because a lot of what has happened to me has impacted the way I process, the way I survive, or the way I think I need to survive. So look at this. First of all, if your score was between 0 and 2, consider yourself an incredibly blessed person and be grateful for the childhood you were able to have. That's a wonderful thing. If your score is above that, here's some of the warnings that come if you're like me and you've been through a little bit more than other people. People who have experienced trauma, this is a score, again, of higher than 3 on this ACE score, 4 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 3 times more likely to need to use antidepressant medication, 3 times more likely to be absent from work, 3 times more likely to experience depression, 3 times more likely to have serious job problems, 15 times more likely to die by suicide. That's astonishing. 1,200% more likely, I think, is what I was looking at earlier today, to be dealing with wanting to end their life. So again, what we find is that people who have grown up in pretty healthy homes tend to not have the same understanding of why some people struggle so much, right? Because they didn't have the trauma inflicted upon them. So it's hard for them to understand and have compassion for people who are struggling with daily life. And this is part of why I wanted to introduce this to you, because if that's you and you haven't been through a lot, maybe it's hard for you to understand why some people just keep making boneheaded decisions time and time again. And if you're the person who's above that and you do make boneheaded decisions, or you have in the past quite a bit, maybe this gives you some understanding of where that's coming from. Because as your brain was developing, you had adverse experiences that took place. We're going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow. But this, again, is what tends to happen. You have adverse childhood experiences that disrupts your brain's development. So your brain does not develop in the same way as other people's. That's just the reality. What often happens from that is in some way, either in our social life, our emotional life, or in our cognitive, our thinking life, we are impaired. So we struggle in some way where other people may not struggle because of what has happened to us. So because of that, we tend to adopt some sort of health risk behavior. So we hang out with the wrong crowd more likely. Right? We're drawn towards drinking, or we're drawn towards doing things that other people are not necessarily drawn towards. And that leads over time oftentimes to disease or disability or having problems, social problems, which oftentimes at the end, if nothing changes, can result in an early death. I know that this is absolutely the case because when I worked with kids who were on probation, now, I never did the ACE study with them, but if you got to know their families at all, every single time I was like, well, no wonder you're going through what you're going through. Like, no wonder you're struggling. I don't know how you're even surviving. Like, sometimes I meet these kids and they'd be such a mess, and some of them would be really hard to work with. And then I meet their parents. And I'm like, wow, like, I'm shocked you're still around because these people are mistreating you so badly or neglecting you or whatever else. And it becomes a generational thing, right? So those kids grow up unloved or hurting or whatever, and if nothing changes, they tend to grow up not loving their children. They tend to grow up making the same mistakes their parents did, and the cycle continues. Here's the good news, because I've laid a lot of heavy stuff here. This is not inevitable. Are you with me? That means that just because bad things happen to you does not mean that you have to have a terrible life and you have to die early. That's not the case. God has made our brains to be changeable, right? There's this big fancy word called neuroplasticity. That simply means that when something gets messed up in your brain, it can rewire. When you have an impairment in some area, literally you can have half of your brain removed, and your brain can adapt to be fully functional with only half of the brain. Isn't that incredible? What it means is we need to be intentional people, right? We are aware now of the problem. If you weren't before, now you can become aware of why people might be struggling. Maybe it's not what's wrong with you. Maybe it's what has happened to you. Are you with me? Maybe the reason why people behave in the way that they behave is because they've been in survival mode for so much of their life. And that's why they do or do not do the things that most people would do or not do. Right? And so this is the challenge, but what we're going to talk about is how to build resiliency. It's never too late for us to retrain our brains. It's never too late for us to take God's tools and help us to become happy and healthy people. That is totally possible, no matter what has happened to you. And that's good news, right? That's good news. And so that's what we're going to start delving into. Tomorrow I want to talk a little bit more about what is actually happening in your brain, the stress response and the fight, flight, freeze, you might have heard of that before, and how we get to that point, and why that's actually a good thing in some situations, why it's a bad thing in other situations, and how to manage that. But for tonight, I just wanted to introduce you to this concept of trauma. Because when we talk about anxiety or depression, when we talk about even ADHD, you know what we found with a lot of kids who are diagnosed with ADHD? They're really traumatized kids. Not all of them, but many of them are traumatized. And so we're treating the ADHD, we're treating the depression, we'll give an antidepressant, which is not always a bad thing. But what we're not treating oftentimes is why these children are depressed in the first place, or why these adults are going through the anxiety that they're going through. What has happened to these people that has led their bodies and their brains to be responding in this way? Does that make sense at all? Okay, so that's where we're going. We're getting ready to finish because I've already gone over time, as usual. But I did want to open the floor. Did you guys have any thoughts or any responses at this time based on what we talked about tonight? We're going to bring the microphone to you because we're streaming. We want to be sure everyone can hear.
Age can you determine, can someone know how early, what age, they experience, or they can label it traumatized? Can a baby be traumatized and that be reflected later on in life? And how would you be able to determine that?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So the sad answer is, even before the baby is born, trauma can impact that child, right? And so that's why we know if the mother was addicted to drugs, that impacts the brain's development in the womb. And so the baby can be born with addictions. The baby can be born with some impairments. Sometimes those can be permanent, but they don't have to be as bad, right, as if there's early treatment, if there's people who can connect and find out as early as possible. How can we find out? Well, part of it is we want to train like medical professionals and other people who will work with babies to identify signs of abuse or neglect or these other things, right? We want people to know and to be aware of what it might look like a baby that's not crying. Why is the baby not crying? It's natural for a baby to cry. So what might be going on there? Again, this is not to penalize parents and families. This is to have compassion for these children and to do what we can to disrupt cycles that have already started to take place. But yes, the earlier the abuse takes, not just abuse, the earlier the adverse childhood experience takes place, the more challenging it tends to be for them to, now you hear this all the time, kids are resilient, right? They'll be fine. It's oftentimes the opposite. If they've been through a lot at a very young age, especially the first 2 years of their life, they're going to have oftentimes the most challenging road to recovery of anybody else, because those are critical years for the development of a child's brain. Now, we won't always know. And there's people who are walking around today who are saying, what is wrong with me? I don't understand why I'm struggling so much. And it may be because of what happened to them before they even have memory, right? Those first 2 years of life. And so that is a challenge, but it's not something that we can, that's insurmountable. It's still something that people can always change and grow and do better. I saw another hand, I think.
Yeah, there's one back there.
Oh, okay, yes.
Earlier when you were talking about the perspective of the big T's and the little T's, is that perspective what can cause like someone that comes forward saying, oh, I'm being emotionally abused or I'm being neglected, to often receive the response of, no, you're not, you're just looking for attention?
Yes, that absolutely can be a response, right? And many times, depending on who you're talking to, so like say a person comes forward and talks to their family and says, this has happened to me, or this is happening to me. Sometimes the family member will become very protective, right? Because it's very uncomfortable to admit that something might be happening, especially like a parent oftentimes does not want to admit that their child was abused, right? That's a failure on the parent. That's how they feel, right? And so oftentimes it is easier to just pretend the person is lying about what has happened to them. And so that does happen a lot. Also, because of the big T and the little t, we tend in our minds most of the time to have this like hierarchy. These are real traumas, and these are just little things, right? And so you shouldn't make a big deal out of these little things. But the reality is, according to the science, what we've seen in brain scans, they're equivalent. It doesn't matter what type of trauma it is. If it's overwhelming the system, the impact will be the same.
My question is, do you think that any of this has to do with hereditary?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think my very next slide is intergenerational trauma. There's absolutely a part of this, and if you've ever heard of the big term epigenetics, there's the idea that there are genetic things that are passed down from parent to child. That's absolutely, not only is it scientific, it's biblical, right? The sins of the father and so on. We know that this is just the reality. And so what our families have been through have impacted us before we're even born. What we find with things like epigenetics and this heredity stuff is that you might have certain genetic dispositions. For example, some people have an addictive gene, meaning that when they try a substance, they're far more likely to become addicted. Not everyone is, right? Some people could try something, experiment it in college, and then they can just stop. And they don't understand why other people can't stop. Well, there's a genetic component to that. But what they found with that, with epigenetics, is that just because you have a disposition to that, it's the environment that sort of decides whether or not that genetic capability gets turned on or off, right? In other words, how you're raised impacts your heredity and your genetics in a major way.
Okay, so let me see how I can word the question. So let's say that you raised up in, hypothetically, let's say if you're raised up in a good house, right? You didn't have none of these, you had a 0 score, right? But you still have mental issues like you get anxiety or you get depression or something like that, or you're dealing with a certain addiction. Mm-hmm. Where do those come from, basically?
Yeah. Okay, so there's one part where the reality is we're all human, right? Just because you were raised in a great home doesn't mean you're not going to struggle. Not everything is trauma, right? There are other elements at play. There's just the reality of our challenges and our condition. One thing for young people in particular is it is becoming more and more demonstrated with science, not just young people, but especially young people, that screen time does impact our mental well-being. And I'm guilty of this. Like I have a lot of screen time, right? Because I do it for work, I do it for research, and then I do it for fun. So I'm on the screen all the time. But they're finding more and more studies that are showing that that increases our risk of depression and increases our risk of anxiety, right? And the pandemic, we're going to talk a little bit about the pandemic. The pandemic impacted everybody, but especially young people, right? Because we were cut off from a lot of our friends and family that we usually were able to see. It was a disruption in our schedule. People missed really important events like graduations, birthday parties, couldn't see their grandparents sometimes for the last time. Like all of those things can also impact us. So it's not just your family, right? It's your environment. In fact, this is the other slide, 3 realms of ACEs. So that first ACE study only focused on the household. But there's also the community. So the community you live in also has adverse experiences. If you grow up in a healthy community, that's a positive thing. It builds resilience. If you grow up in a community where there's not a lot of jobs, there's a lot of drug addiction, it's not safe to walk to school because, someone might hurt you, whatever, take advantage of you, that's an adverse experience as well. And then there's the environment. And you probably can't read this, but at the bottom of the environmental ACEs, can you read that word all the way at the bottom? It says pandemic. So that means that every child that's grown up, right, in the last several years, everybody's had at least one adverse childhood experience. So what I'm saying, that's a long-winded answer of saying that there's all kinds of things that could be coming up. It's not just your family. If somebody is online all the time, and again, they're witnessing stuff online, that can bring out a lot of anxiety. Maybe you've heard of doom scrolling. People will go through like Twitter, and they'll just keep going and reading bad news after bad news after bad news. That's really bad for our mental health. It's the same thing as people who sit, adults who sit and watch the news, 24-hour news all day. It's just as bad for our mental health, right? So I would say, if someone were to ask me that, I would have a bunch of questions about their life, what they've been up to, what they do, you know, are they living healthy lives? Sometimes it's as simple as people just aren't getting enough sleep, right? If you're getting 3 or 4 hours of sleep every night, you're probably going to be dealing with anxiety and depression.
So, whenever you're talking about the things where you could have been traumatized as a baby within the first 2 years of your life, and say you're talking to a friend and they open up to you, which is great, and then they tell you about these things that they're absolutely terrified of, but they say they don't know why. How or in what way would you try to assist them in overcoming said fear or traumatize?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of like, I think it was your question, where when someone is opening up and they're sharing some heavy things, and we're going to talk about that, especially on the night where I talk about depression and suicidality and all that, we're going to talk about, as friends, what do we do and what don't we do? One of the things I would say is if you have a friend who's opening up to you about that, there's certain things you can do about just, hey, I appreciate you sharing this with me. I'm here for you. Like, I got your back no matter what. I'm your friend. Sorry you're going through that. If it's taking over your life, this is what I would suggest as a friend. If it's taking over your life, have you considered talking to someone with some training, right? Because the reality is you don't have the training to help them. And you, as much as you want to, well, maybe you do. I don't know. I don't know you. Maybe you're a doctor. But what I mean is, in general, right, we don't have that training. Before a couple years ago, I didn't really have that training myself. And so my role is friend. I'm a support system. I'm here to help. I'm here to love. You know, with healthy boundaries, I'm going to be there for this friend. But if this is taking over their life, that's when we talk about the word clinical. Like when things become clinical, depression becomes clinical, anxiety becomes clinical. What it means is that is something that is taking over their life and actually having a negative impact. Because all of us get anxious sometimes, right? All of us get sad sometimes, right? That's a natural part of the human condition. But when that sadness takes over your life, that's when it becomes another level. When that fear takes over your life, that's when you might need somebody else who has a little bit more training, who can help them to understand maybe where it's coming from. So that's what I would suggest. And yes?
Just before we got here, we just came from another meeting, and the interesting thing was, one of the topics was screen time. And screen time, when we get too much, and I've been thinking about this lately too. It's like your interests change, but the way your mind processes, it changes too.
Yeah.
And it's got me thinking about my screen time.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. And they've also seen several studies where, you know, if you turn off your phone or your tablet or whatever right before you go to bed, you miss out on a lot of the deeper sleep that your body really needs for recovery, right? So even if you are sleeping, you're not in that REM sleep that you need to have. You won't get the same sleep cycle. So they're finding over and over again that, you know, if you are on your screen, whatever, about 20 to 30 minutes before you go to bed, you shouldn't have any more screens. You do something else. You know, if you like to exercise, exercise. If you like to read, do that. Go for a walk. Whatever it is, just don't have your screen around you for the last 20 minutes before you go to bed, and you'll find that most people will sleep much better as a result. I think it's time. Did anybody else have a pressing question they wanted to share? Okay, we got one more.
So with the big T and the little t, I think, if I'm not mistaken, on the little t, one of the things was the failure experiences.
Yeah.
How could someone identify or get someone to explain whenever a failure experience goes from a little T to a big T?
That's a good question.
Because let's say I could go swimming and almost drown, but that wouldn't prevent me from going back swimming. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But so how or what determines?
Well, I think you just nailed it. So it becomes a traumatic experience when you start avoiding other things afterwards. So if you had this really terrible swimming experience, but after calming down and processing it, you're like, okay, I know what happened, I'm okay, and you jump back into swimming and you're okay afterwards, even if you're a little nervous, then it hasn't overwhelmed your capacity to cope. You were able to deal with the stress that came up. If somebody gets to a failure experience where they were really working towards something, maybe they really thought they were going to get a scholarship, right, to this college, and then they failed for whatever reason. They failed an entrance exam or whatever else happened. They don't get that scholarship, and afterwards, they just sort of give up. Like they don't want to even try to get into school anymore. They don't want to try to do anything else with their life. That's when it's overwhelmed them, right? That's when it may have become a traumatic experience. Not all failure is going to be traumatic. In fact, failure is really good for us sometimes. But when it overwhelms our capacity to cope, that's like, I keep saying that, but that's the key. When you're just overwhelmed and you get to a point of fight, flight, freeze, that's when it becomes a traumatic experience. Thank you guys so much for your time. I'll go ahead and pray unless you wanted to. Okay. And then I hope to see you tomorrow. I hope you are able to invite your friends. I know some of you have busy schedules, but this is, I hope, a blessing for you. And it's a blessing for me to be here. Let's pray. Dear Father, thank you so much that you have not abandoned us in this traumatic world, that you have not left us here to just be ruined by the mess that's all around us, but that you promised to be with us, you promised to go through it with us, and you have created us with this incredible brain that is geared for survival, and it is made to heal. And Lord, I pray for each person here, for those who need healing in some area of their life, I pray that you provide it. For those who know somebody, and they're caring deeply for this person, and they don't know what to do, I pray that you give them wisdom and guidance in how to be the best friend. And I pray that you bless them and bless our time together this week. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right, so just real quick to share with you guys before you leave. So we have some seminars going on the Spanish side. Right now they're doing the second part of that seminar, but that's all they're getting. And it's funny because today, at the end of the first seminar they did, they said, somebody came up to me and said, hey, that was really good information. If we just need a month's worth of this, and I think we'll be set. It's not possible. With that group, we're only able to do these 2 seminars. Here, we're doing 5. This is the first one. We're going to have 4 more. This isn't the type of thing that we get every day, but it's a type of thing that we ought to take advantage of when we have it, and we get to ask direct questions. We realize that for some people, you may want to ask something like on a more personal basis. So this is what we're going to do. As we mentioned a moment ago, if you would like a special season of prayer, I'm asking our sister Juliet. She's over here? Okay, she's going to be over here if you would like just special prayer. This is no kind of counseling, advice. This is just prayer. If you want to pray for you, pray for you, pray for somebody that you love, and if you feel comfortable with it being a group prayer afterwards, we'll pray about it on a prayer line or on Wednesday evening. Over here, Pastor Jose, the assistant, he's going to take down information. If you want to meet with Pastor Mello, as opposed to just having people sitting around right now or later, Pastor Jose, what he's going to do is he'll just get your information in his schedule so that one of these evenings before or after the meeting, you could talk with James Mello, and then maybe he can help guide a conversation or direct you towards some kind of appropriate help, and we'll have other people here this week. So to just simplify, if you would like prayer over some specific, or you can be as general as you want, you can come over here to see our sister Juliet. And if you would like to just schedule a time, like we're going to meet right now with somebody real quickly with Pastor Mello, but if you would like to schedule a time to just ask some specific questions that you don't want to put out there in the open, please get over here to Pastor Jose. Just let him get your information, and he will set that up. All right? We hope to see you guys again this week. On your way out, please grab some food. We don't want to have any food left over. Grab some food to take to go. And for those who are church members, if you can help us kind of get stuff up real quickly so that we have this ready for Christ Chapel to use in the morning, we'd appreciate it. We'll see you guys tomorrow at 6:30. Thank you.